Enlisted. Series premiere coming this January too.
Do you still think about those underrated sitcoms, the ones that ended just as they were getting good? These shows had heart, great characters, and something special that never got the time it needed to grow. What did we lose when networks gave up too soon? Some sitcoms quietly sneak into your memory and never leave. The Torkelsons was one of those shows, a soft-spoken gem that aired for only 2 seasons and still managed to say more than some series say in 10. Set in the small town of Pyramid Corners, Oklahoma, it followed Millicent Torkelson, a single mother raising 5 kids on her own. They lived in a creaky old house with bills they could not pay and dreams they could barely hold on to. But somehow, it never felt bleak. It felt honest. At the center of the story was Dorothy Jane, the teenage daughter with big thoughts and bigger feelings. She would sit by her attic window and talk to the man in the moon, delivering monologues that felt more like poetry than sitcom narration. It was gentle, thoughtful, sincere, and that sincerity is what made it stand out. This was not a show built around punchlines. It was built around people. People trying their best with what little they had, finding small joys in hard days. There were no quick fixes, no magical resolutions at the end of every episode, just growth, a little at a time, told with patience and grace. Unlike most shows of the era, the Torkelsons did not use poverty as a gag. It showed the real weight of overdue bills and single motherhood. It showed kids learning to do without and a mom learning to hold everything together with duct tape and hope. But it also showed love, the kind that does not need perfect circumstances to feel strong. The performances were grounded and full of heart. Connie Ray played Millicent with quiet strength, never sentimental, never bitter, just deeply human. Olivia Burnett brought Dorothy Jane to life with vulnerability that felt real, not rehearsed. And while the show had its share of sitcom moments, quirky neighbors, school dances, awkward crushes, everything was filtered through a tone that felt gentle without being dull. The comedy never undercut the emotion. After 1 season, the show was retooled into Almost Home. Some characters disappeared. The family moved to Seattle. The tone changed. The heart stayed, but something essential got lost in the shift. That 2nd season was fine, still watchable, still better than most shows on the air at the time, but it lacked the quiet magic of Pyramid Corners. It lacked the attic window. What the Torkelsons did best was remind you what mattered, that life did not have to be big to be meaningful, that small kindnesses and quiet strength were enough to build a whole world around. It never got the ratings it deserved, never the buzz, but the people who saw it remember it clearly, and not because it was flashy, because it felt true. The Torkelsons should have had more seasons, more time to let those kids grow up, more time to show that being ordinary can still be extraordinary. But maybe the fact that it ended early is part of why it still feels special. Like a letter you find years later. Familiar, faded, and still full of everything you needed to hear. You can always tell when a show knows it is smarter than it looks. Better Off Ted was exactly that. A razor-sharp workplace comedy that hid its satire behind brightly lit labs, motion sensors, and weaponized pumpkins. Set inside the fictional tech giant Viridian Dynamics, the show followed Ted Crisp, a good man trapped in a company with no moral compass. He was the head of research and development. He reported to Veronica, the world's most polished sociopath. And together they tried to build the future one unethical prototype at a time. It was a corporate comedy, sure, but it was also a mirror held up to modern life. How we justify bad decisions with memos, how companies sell innovation and deliver chaos, how decency becomes a liability in a system built for profit. The jokes were fast, the tone was dry, and the show moved like it was always 3 steps ahead of the audience, which somehow never felt smug. It trusted you to keep up. It assumed you were paying attention, and if you were, it rewarded you with some of the smartest, strangest punchlines on television. Jay Harrington played Ted with this perfect mix of optimism and exhaustion, a man trying to do the right thing while the floor kept moving underneath him. Portia de Rossi's Veronica was terrifying in the best way, composed, brilliant, and completely detached from human emotion. And Jonathan Slavin and Malcolm Barrett as the scientists Phil and Lem? They were the soul of the show, two weirdos who cared more about lab rats than quarterly goals. The writing was fearless. One episode tackled race via motion sensor bathrooms that could not recognize black employees. Another had the company freezing one of its scientists to test a theory, then forgetting to unfreeze him. It was absurd, but it always made a point. And that is what made Better Off Ted different from every other office comedy. It was not just zany, it was intentional. Every joke had weight, every storyline had a purpose. But Fox never figured out how to sell it. It was too weird, too smart, too quiet in a sea of laugh tracks and workplace cliches. It was canceled after 2 seasons, 26 episodes that felt like a masterclass in how to write comedy with a conscience. It deserved more time to push its stories, more chances to dig into the strange brilliance of its world. Because Better Off Ted was not just clever, it was cutting. It was honest. It was satire that knew exactly where to aim, and somehow never missed. And the fact that so few people saw it when it aired just proves the show's entire point. If you tell the truth too well, most people will not realize it until it is already gone. Some shows feel too real to last. My So-Called Life was one of those shows, a single-season miracle that captured teenage life with such unflinching honesty, it was almost painful to watch. It followed Angela Chase, played by Claire Danes, a high school sophomore caught in that space between who she used to be and who she might become. She dyed her hair red. She stared at walls. She questioned everything. And through her voiceovers, we heard every messy, anxious, beautiful thought she was too scared to say out loud. It was not about prom or popularity. It was about the silences between friends, the way a hallway can feel like the longest place in the world, and how impossible it is to explain why you feel sad when everything looks normal. Angela was not a perfect protagonist. She was impulsive, selfish, and confused, but that was the point. Every character in the show felt lived in. You saw parents struggling with their own disappointments, teachers trying and failing to connect, and classmates hiding entire identities behind tired smiles. It was not heightened for effect. It was grounded in emotional truth. And that is what made it different. The show did not flinch from tough subjects. Ricky's queerness, Rayanne's drinking, Sharon's guilt, Brian's loneliness. These characters were not after-school special versions of teenagers. They were teenagers. And they did not always get closure. Sometimes they just moved forward, dragging the weight with them. Even Angela's crush on Jordan Catalano, played by Jared Leto, felt more like an ache than a story arc. He was mysterious and beautiful and absolutely not ready for the pedestal Angela built under him. But the show never mocked her for it. It let her learn slowly and with dignity. My So-Called Life aired at a time when teen television was still largely surface level. Shows about youth were written for adults, but this one felt like it had been ripped from someone's real diary. The writing was layered, the performances were subtle, and the tone, quiet, uncertain, intimate, was unlike anything else on television. ABC never knew what to do with it. Ratings were low, the schedule changed constantly, and even though critics raved and fans pleaded, the network pulled the plug after just 19 episodes. But those 19 episodes are still being discovered, still being quoted, still showing up in essays about the first time someone felt seen on screen. My So-Called Life did not need 5 seasons. It needed one more. Just enough to let Angela keep walking, keep stumbling, keep becoming. Because watching her grow meant we got to grow too. Sometimes the shows that burn the brightest do not burn long, but that does not mean they deserve to end so soon. Every now and then, a show comes along that gets everything right, and still disappears. Enlisted was one of those shows. A military comedy that was warm, hilarious, and surprisingly heartfelt, all packed into 13 perfect episodes. Set at a fictional Florida Army base, the show followed 3 brothers serving in the same unit. Pete, the overachieving sergeant just back from Afghanistan, Derek, the sarcastic slacker, and Randy, the big-hearted screw-up with more optimism than coordination. It was about family, about grief, about what it means to serve your country when you are not in combat, but in the quiet trenches of maintenance work, pushing paper and picking up after everyone else. And it was funny. Really funny. Not in a punchline every 15 seconds kind of way, but in a character-driven, well-earned, laugh-from-your-gut kind of way. The humor came from love, not mockery. The show never punched down. It lifted up people we rarely see in uniform on screen. The ones behind the scenes, doing the unglamorous work and still showing up every day. What made Enlisted stand out was how deeply it cared. It let its characters be ridiculous without being reduced. Pete was a hero with trauma. Derek was a cynic with a buried sense of honor. And Randy, played brilliantly by Parker Young, was one of the most sincere characters to ever walk into a punchline. The show balanced silliness with sincerity like it had been doing it for years, but it only got 13 episodes. Fox aired them out of order, promoted it poorly, and by the time anyone realized what was happening, Enlisted was gone. It deserved more. Not just because it was good, but because it was rare. A show about the military that was not political. That honored service without turning into propaganda. That showed men expressing emotion, caring for each other, being silly and flawed and whole. In another timeline, Enlisted got 5 seasons and a syndication deal. We watched the brothers grow, we watched the base evolve, and we saw more stories about the people who keep everything running but never make the headlines. But in our timeline, it became a cult favorite, a show you recommend to friends like a secret. Trust me, you say. You'll love it. Just watch. And when they do, they get it. Enlisted was the kind of show that made you laugh and then, quietly, made you feel better about the world. And that is exactly the kind of show we never get enough of. Some shows break the fourth wall. This one kicked it down, rebuilt it into a stage, and started monologuing right into your living room. Andy Richter Controls the Universe was not just a clever title. It was a rare example of a sitcom that understood how weird and wonderful our inner lives really are. It followed Andy Richter as a technical manual writer working in a soul-numbing corporate office. But the real story was happening inside his head. We saw what he wanted to say, what he wished he had done, and what he was too polite or too scared to act on. Reality blended with fantasy, and the result was one of the smartest and strangest comedies of the early 2000s. It was a show built on contradictions. The tone was deadpan, but the content was chaotic. The pacing was fast, but the ideas were thoughtful. And the jokes, sharp, dense, often absurd, landed with the kind of precision you only get when a writing team actually cares. Andy was not a hero. He was anxious, hesitant, kind of stuck. But watching him try to navigate work, love, and his own overactive imagination made him deeply relatable. He was all the things we are when we think no one is watching. And that honesty made the show quietly revolutionary. The supporting cast elevated everything. Paget Brewster played Jessica, Andy's smart, intimidating boss and object of unrequited love. James Patrick Stewart, Irene Malloy, and Jonathan Slavin rounded out the office misfits, each one perfectly weird in their own way. There was no laugh track, no set-up punchline rhythm, just crisp dialogue, clever timing, and surreal asides that somehow always tied back to something real. The show's greatest trick was making its most ridiculous moments feel grounded. Whether Andy was imagining a conversation with Benjamin Franklin or spiraling over a printer jam, it all made emotional sense. His inner life was exaggerated but never dishonest. It was also one of the first shows to explore mental health without ever naming it. You saw the doubt, the internal monologue, the anxiety. It was funny, but also familiar, especially for anyone who has ever overthought a handshake or reimagined a conversation 12 different ways. Andy Richter Controls the Universe aired on FOX, but was bounced around the schedule like a show they had no idea how to sell. It got 1 full season and 5 unaired episodes that eventually trickled out. The critics loved it, the fans adored it. But without network support, it quietly disappeared. Still, it left a mark. Later shows like Scrubs, 30 Rock and Crazy Ex-Girlfriend would take similar risks with voiceovers, fantasy sequences, and deeply flawed leads. But Andy got there first, and maybe that is why it still matters, because it showed us that comedy does not have to be loud to be bold, that a show about a guy sitting in his cubicle thinking too much could be just as thrilling as anything else on television. It should have had more seasons. It earned them. But sometimes, the best shows are the ones that felt a little too smart for their own time. Some sitcoms hit you with a laugh. Others get under your skin and sit with you. Dear John was both, a quietly affecting comedy about heartbreak, healing, and the strange way strangers become the people who save you. It began with a letter. John Lacey, played by Judd Hirsch, comes home one day to find a note from his wife. She is leaving him and taking everything. His marriage is over. His life has collapsed. And so he ends up in a support group for divorced and single people, trying to make sense of what comes next. The group was called the 121 Club, and its members were weird, wounded, and wonderfully drawn. There was Louise, the uptight leader with a rule book for everything. Kirk, the pathological liar with a new identity every week. Kate, the kind-hearted confidant. And Ralph, the sweet, socially awkward guy with the most honest eyes on the show. It was not flashy. It was not wild. But Dear John was rich with emotion. It showed people trying to rebuild their lives with as much grace as they could manage, and sometimes with none at all. The show understood that being alone is not the same as being lonely. And it reminded us that grief comes in waves, but so does laughter. Judd Hirsch anchored everything with a performance that was restrained but full of depth. John was not a sitcom dad. He was not a loser. He was a man trying to figure out who he was without the relationship that had defined him. And in the faces of the other group members, he saw pieces of himself, his past, his fears, his possible future. What made the show work was how it balanced sincerity with absurdity. Every meeting at the 121 Club felt like it could fall apart at any moment, and sometimes it did. But the moments of honesty, when they came, hit hard. There were real stakes, real sadness, but never manipulation. The show did not play its pain for drama, it just let people feel what they felt, then helped them laugh again. Dear John ran for 4 seasons, and yet it still feels underrated. It never had the cultural footprint of shows like Cheers or Frasier, but in terms of emotional intelligence, it was just as rich. It captured a moment in life that rarely gets airtime, not the beginning, not the end, but the long middle where things hurt, but you keep going anyway. In its best episodes, Dear John felt like therapy. In its weakest, it still felt like someone who understood you. And that is not nothing. It may not have ended too early in terms of seasons, but in terms of recognition, it never got what it earned. And for the people who watched it late at night, alone, when they were hurting, there was nothing underrated about it. Some shows walk in with confidence, crack a joke, and leave before anyone realizes how good they were. Benched was one of those shows, sharp, fast, and far more heartfelt than its premise let on. It aired for just 1 season in 2014, but in that short time, it delivered some of the smartest, most underrated workplace comedy of the decade. It followed Nina Whitley, a corporate attorney played by Eliza Coupe, who has a full-on meltdown after being passed over for partner at her fancy firm. Publicly humiliated and personally wrecked, she spirals straight into a job at the public defender's office, where the prestige is gone, the caseloads are endless, and the furniture is one loud sneeze away from collapse. It sounds like a setup for a fish-out-of-water sitcom, but Benched never played it that simple. Nina was not just a type A control freak who needed to be taken down a peg. She was smart, angry, overworked, and deeply human. The show let her be all of that, without apology, without pity. That is what made Benched matter. It was not just about her fall from grace. It was about what she found after the fall. Because underneath the fluorescent lights and broken systems, there were people. Real, messy, broke people who showed up every day to do a job no one else wanted. And the comedy? It did not come from mocking them. It came from watching them hold the system together with duct tape, sarcasm, and a last shred of belief that maybe, just maybe, they could still do some good. Jay Harrington played Phil, the jaded veteran of The Office who drinks his coffee black and his optimism even darker. He and Nina were opposites on paper, but their slow, friction-filled alliance became one of the show's most rewarding threads. It was not a will they won't they. It was a do they even have time to care. And that made it feel real. The supporting cast was a dream. Jolene, the secretary who ran the place like a low-budget mob boss. Carlos, the idealist rookie with more passion than experience. A courtroom filled with uncooperative clients, exhausted judges, and prosecutors who barely bothered to pretend they were playing fair. But no one was a caricature. Every character was grounded. Every laugh had weight. Even the throwaway lines were layered with frustration, hope, and just enough absurdity to remind you that, yes, this was still a comedy. Eliza Coupe gave the performance of her career. Nina was chaotic, smart, vulnerable, and constantly trying not to cry or scream or punch someone in the throat. And you believed every second of it. She was not a hero. She was not a wreck. She was a person trying to hold herself together in a world that kept trying to pull her apart. And then, just like that, it was gone. 12 episodes. That was all it got. One season. No renewal. No wrap-up. Just silence. USA Network aired it with little promotion and less patience. And while critics praised it, the numbers never caught up. But the people who found benched, they never forgot it. Because it was not just another legal comedy. It was a show about failure. About what happens when everything you built falls apart and the only thing left to do is show up anyway. And in that small, messy courtroom, Benched found something worth staying for. Even if the network never did. Some sitcoms dream big. This one dreamed of robbing Mick Jagger. The Knights of Prosperity was that rare high-concept comedy that dared to be both ridiculous and deeply human, and somehow pulled it off. The idea was simple, absurd, and perfect. A group of average, working-class New Yorkers form a ragtag crew with one shared mission: break into Mick Jagger's penthouse and steal his fortune. He played himself in the pilot, fully in on the joke. The setup was surreal. The tone? Even better. It was Ocean's 11 if Danny Ocean was a janitor with nothing to lose and a mop bucket full of ambition. Donald Logue starred as Eugene Gherkin, a man who had scrubbed floors for too many years and finally snapped, not in a violent way, but in a let's rob a rock star and change our lives way. He was not angry. He was tired. Tired of being invisible. Tired of doing everything right and still coming up short. So he recruited a team. The team was ridiculous. A nerdy locksmith, a security guard with delusions of grandeur, a waitress with sharp elbows and sharper instincts, a guy who almost made it onto Wheel of Fortune. They were misfits, screw-ups, dreamers, and that is exactly why it worked. Because deep down, everyone on that show knew they were not just robbing Mick Jagger, they were trying to steal back a piece of their own lives. The writing was fast. The jokes were layered. The pacing moved like a caper film but always stopped long enough to let the emotional weight sink in. And that balance? It is hard to pull off. Because for all its antics, the Knights of Prosperity had something most comedies do not: sincerity. Eugene's dream was not just about money. It was about mattering, about proving that even nobodies can do something bold, something loud, something that shakes the windows of the penthouse and makes the world notice. The cast had incredible chemistry. Sofia Vergara, yes, before Modern Family, Lenny Venito, Maz Jobrani, Kevin Michael Richardson, they played off each other like they had been doing it for years. And they gave their characters just enough absurdity to make you laugh and just enough heart to make you care. ABC aired it in early 2007. It was supposed to be the next big thing. But then, it got moved, delayed, pulled from schedule, put back, pulled again. 13 episodes aired, 8 more were shelved. And just like that, the heist ended before it really began. Critics praised it, fans loved it, but it got buried under network confusion and bad timing. That still stings. Because this show had legs. It could have moved on from Mick Jagger to Donald Trump. Yes, really, that was Season 2's plan. And then on to other celebrity targets. But more importantly, it had a reason to keep going. A reason most sitcoms forget. It gave underdogs the spotlight, and it let them fail, dream, try again, and fail better. The Knights of Prosperity deserved more seasons, more heists, more chances. But like any good heist, maybe its short run made it legendary. Because even if they never cracked the safe, they cracked something else: how to make a sitcom feel like a cause worth rooting for. Some shows are just too strange, too smart, and too sincere for their own good. The Middleman was one of them. A quirky, genre-hopping, whip-smart sci-fi comedy that landed in 2008 and was gone before most people even realized it existed. 1 season, 12 episodes, and in that short time, it managed to build a world unlike anything else on television. The premise sounds like something pulled from a vintage comic book, and that's exactly what it was. Wendy Watson, a struggling artist with a dry wit and a sharper tongue, gets recruited to be the sidekick of a secret agent superhero known only as the Middleman. Their job? Defend the world from unnatural threats. That includes robotic vampires, cursed telenovelas, alien boy bands, and tentacled monstrosities that live in sub-basements below hot dog stands. It was bizarre. It was beautiful. It was never boring. Matt Kieslar played the titular Middleman with the square-jawed earnestness of a 1950s cartoon hero, an unshakable moral compass, a love of clean language, and a deep respect for procedure. Natalie Morales, as Wendy, was his perfect foil, sarcastic, modern, endlessly relatable, and clearly wondering how she got roped into all of this. But she stayed, because deep down, she wanted to believe the world could be better too. That was the secret of the Middleman. It looked like a cartoon, but it cared like a drama. It made jokes about everything from anime to noir cinema to pulp fiction, but never at the expense of its characters. It was parody without cruelty, camp without cynicism. It had the brain of a pop culture encyclopedia and the heart of a Saturday morning cartoon, and it never once flinched from its own weirdness. The dialogue moved fast. Faster than most viewers were ready for. Every line was packed with references, reversals, or just plain wordplay. You had to keep up, and if you did, you got rewarded. But for all its cleverness, what made The Middleman special was its sincerity. In an era of snark and anti-heroes, here was a show about being good, about showing up, about doing the right thing, even when it made you look uncool or completely insane. The villains were colorful, the missions were wild, but the show always grounded itself in the partnership between Wendy and the Middleman. They trusted each other, respected each other, and never once tried to turn that chemistry into forced romance. It was refreshing. It was rare. ABC Family never knew what to do with it. They marketed it poorly, aired it in the summer, and yanked it after 12 episodes. A 13th episode was written, but never shot. Instead, it was released as a comic book. But even with just 12 episodes, the show built a cult following, not because it begged for attention, but because it earned it. It was smart without being smug, weird without being messy, and it left you smiling. Years later, people still discover it, still quote it, still wonder why more shows are not allowed to be this playful, this generous, this willing to believe in heroes. The Middleman deserved more, not because it needed to explain itself, but because it had already proven there was so much more story to tell. It is still one of the kindest shows ever made about fighting monsters. Every once in a while, a sitcom comes along that feels like it was written just for you, and Great News was that kind of show. It aired for 2 short seasons on NBC between 2017 and 2018 and packed more wit, warmth, and weirdness into its 23 episodes than most shows do in 5 years. Then it was gone, quietly, unfairly. The premise was delightfully simple. Katie Wendelson, a driven but often overlooked TV news producer, finds her carefully balanced professional life thrown into chaos when her mother, Carol becomes the newsroom's new intern. That is it. That is the entire setup. But somehow, the show turned that setup into a workplace comedy, a family sitcom, and a story about self-worth, all at the same time. Briga Heelan played Katie with just the right blend of ambition and self-doubt. She wanted to make a difference, to be taken seriously, to be seen. Andrea Martin, as Carol, brought chaos, but the good kind. She was the mom who meant well, talked too much, and bulldozed boundaries with a smile. But she was also layered, funny, and wise in ways no one expected. Their relationship was the core of the show. Complicated, loud, loving. Katie trying to grow up, Carol trying to stay relevant. Both of them fumbling their way through a world that moves too fast and asks too much. And instead of reducing that dynamic to easy jokes, the show made space for truth. Because being a grown daughter with a still hovering mom, that is not just comedy, it is real life. The supporting cast was a gift. John Michael Higgins as Chuck, the old-school anchor slowly unraveling into chaos. Nicole Richie, yes, that Nicole Richie, played Portia, the stylish co-anchor who turned out to be surprisingly sharp. And Adam Campbell as Greg, the network boss who had no idea how to deal with any of them. The jokes came fast, but never felt forced. There were one-liners, callbacks, physical gags, and moments of absolute surrealism that somehow still felt grounded. Like when Chuck thinks he is dying, or Carol becomes addicted to social media. Absurd, yes, but always emotionally rooted. What made Great News stand out was its tone. It was hopeful without being naive, sarcastic but not cruel. It knew the news cycle was broken. It knew modern life was exhausting. And it still believed people were worth the trouble. NBC tried. Sort of. But it never gave the show a great time slot, and it never pushed it the way it deserved. So when the ratings dipped, they pulled the plug. And yet, fans still talk about it, still quote it, still wish for season 3, because Great News was about women who mess up and show up anyway. About moms who refuse to fade into the background. About daughters who try to figure out who they are while still honoring where they came from. It was about trying hard, loving loud, and laughing through it. In the end, it was a show about people who cared too much, in a world that tells you to care less. That is why it mattered. And that is why it still does. If one of these underrated gems still lives rent-free in your memory, tell us in the comments. And if you believe great shows deserve second chances, hit like and subscribe so more people can find the ones that never got theirs.